Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Injury Law Pod. I am your host, Eric Bartlett, 28-year personal injury lawyer, and this is the podcast where we talk about everything personal injury law related. Up today on the episode, we're going to talk about the McDonald's hot coffee episode in history. My daughter, who's in college, is taking a business law class. And the other night, one of her assignments was to watch a video about the McDonald's hot coffee case and answer some questions about it. And so that led her to ask me, what was all this about? So that immediately took me back in a period of time that I lived through as a lawyer, as a personal injury lawyer. And it's really a fascinating study just how public perception can be crafted, if you will, when there are powerful companies involved in taking something and using it to further a narrative and really affect things going forward. So if you're young, you may not even know what I'm talking about. If you're older like me, you may have heard of it. You may have some understanding of the hot coffee case as it was referred to. But let's take a little deep dive today and break this down because it was really a very fascinating situation. Not only what happened in the court case and the trial, but then how this thing exploded in the public and became this symbol of frivolous lawsuits. And I thought the timing of this was perfect. The last episode I did, I broke down the 2024 jury verdicts in the Kansas City area and just kind of, see like in reality how juries are handling personal injury claims when they're presented with them in court. And so this episode piggybacks very well with kind of what we looked at with what juries are actually doing. And so, without further ado, we'll break this McDonald's hot coffee case down. And so the question overriding this is, was it truly a frivolous, ridiculous lawsuit? Or was there more to the story? And the case was not as simple as many were led to believe. So what happened? Well, in 1994, Stella Liebeck, who was a 79-year-old woman at the time, purchased a coffee from a McDonald's in the drive-thru in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she was sitting in her parked car. She had the coffee between her legs and she was attempting to remove the lid of the coffee cup, and she accidentally spilled coffee on her lap. And the coffee caused third-degree burns to her thighs, her groin, and her buttocks. And these injuries actually required her to have skin grafts in the burned areas, and she was hospitalized for 8 days. And she initially, kind of coming out of this, requested $20,000 from McDonald's to essentially cover her medical expenses that she had from this, and they refused. And so then it became a lawsuit, and Liebeck sued McDonald's for both product liability and negligence. And just real quickly, product liability claim essentially alleges that the product sold by the business was defective in and of itself. And then negligence is going to allege that McDonald's owed this customer a duty of care, and that they breached that duty of care, that it was foreseeable that their breach of the care could cause injury, such as the person making the claim suffered in this particular instance. And so she brought claims on both accounts, and they are different in the law. Here were the key arguments in this case. So Liebeck, she argued that the coffee was dangerously hot, between 180 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was far hotter than necessary for human consumption. She argued that McDonald's had received over 700 prior complaints about burns from their coffee, but they did not change the way they brewed their coffee. And finally, she argued that the injuries were severe, and McDonald's refusal to settle led to the lawsuit. Now, McDonald's countered that customers expected, they wanted their coffee hot when they got it, and that Liebeck's injuries were her own fault for placing the cup between her legs, and she should have known the risk when dealing with a hot cup of coffee from a restaurant. So the case did not settle. They filed a lawsuit, did not settle. It went through a full jury trial. And after all the evidence was presented, the jury awarded Liebeck $200,000 in what's known as compensatory damages, which are the damages that are there to make up or to compensate her for her losses. And that can be the medical bills. That can be if for some reason she had lost wages. And then the non-economic part of it, the pain and suffering. With her case, it would also be disfigurement because she had scarring after these skin grafts. Then the jury separately awarded her punitive damages, which are damages that are meant to punish the defendant for their actions. And the jury awarded her $2.7 million for the punitive damages portion of her claim. And that was equivalent to 2 days worth of McDonald's coffee sales at the time. Now, the judge, because there was comparative fault found on her, and I believe it was 30% of fault was assessed to her, 70% to McDonald's. So out of all of that, the $200,000 was reduced to $160,000 by the judge. And then the punitive damages amount was reduced significantly from $2.7 million to $480,000 by the judge. And again, that wasn't really based on the comparative fault. That was based on the judge's ability to assess the punitive damage award and determine if it was reasonable or if it needed to be brought more in line with what the judge believed was reasonable in the case. And subsequently, after all of that, the case was settled for an undisclosed amount. So based on that, and the reason that would happen is, there were going to be appeals, right? McDonald's would appeal the verdict. There would be more time, more uncertainty. So the parties came together, they settled. So McDonald's obviously paid her something, but probably less than the, what is that? Let's see, $640,000 that she was awarded by the jury. So most likely it was settled for some amount less than that to put the case to close. She got money, McDonald's cleared it off their books and it was done. Okay, so after all of this kind of unfolded, there was sort of this media attention brought to it and a public backlash on the case. And it was interesting because it was labeled as an example of the frivolous lawsuits going on in the United States and a symbol of America's litigation crisis. Late night comedians, news outlets, they exaggerated the story. There were lots of, it's like anything, right? You have the facts, and then as you get farther away from the source, the story changes. And, there were misconceptions about she had actually been driving when she was trying to handle this coffee as opposed to being parked. And that, of course, the big narrative that came out of it was, this lady was making up some minor burns so that she could get a big payday. And it was really interesting because business groups and insurance related groups, they took this and they ran with it. And they really pushed this narrative that this was the case to show how broken the United States jury system was, and that there were all these frivolous lawsuits out there and anybody could just file a case, get money for the most ridiculous things. And literally the term hot coffee lawsuit became shorthand for excessive litigation. And again, as a trial lawyer, a personal injury trial lawyer, back in the 90s into the 2000s, I mean, even somewhat today, we have to counter perceptions that were created from the series of events arising out of this case. There was a time where when we were picking juries for cases, we would have to address the hot coffee lawsuit and, talk about that and talk about what people on a jury panel thought about that case, if they knew about it, what their perceptions were of lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits, all those things. So it had this major impact on public perception. So what was the real impact? What was the real legacy of this case? Well, interestingly enough, the case changed corporate behavior, and many fast food restaurants after that now serve their coffee at lower temperatures. And now coffee is generally served around the 150 degree mark or lower than that. And they also, it improved the warning labels and better cup designs as a result. And so I know it's always interesting, and I'm right there because as a lawyer, I have friends and we'll joke about the warnings or something on a product, but that's how these things go. Is there's been a problem, and it wasn't identified when it should have been, and then over time, based on legal action, warnings are put in place, designs are redone, changes are made, like the coffee now being served by most restaurants at a lower temperature so they don't cause third degree burns if they spill on somebody. Now, very interesting is in 2011, we had a change because HBO released a documentary called Hot Coffee. This documentary was directed by Susan Saladoff, who is a trial lawyer. And the film aimed to challenge the widely accepted narrative that the McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit was frivolous, and it also wanted to expose the broader issue of corporate influence on the legal system. And so in this documentary, they provided a deep dive into this case, and they presented key facts that were largely ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream media. So what were those? Number one, the severity of the injuries. So in this documentary, they showed the graphic images of Stella Liebeck's third-degree burns, and they emphasized the seriousness of her condition. Many people who had dismissed the case as trivial were shocked to learn just how severe her injuries actually were. The narrative that came out after the case, through the media, through late night comedians, all that stuff, was minor burns and getting millions of dollars for those. And that just wasn't the truth. Those weren't the facts. It also highlighted the fact that McDonald's had received over 700 reports of burns from its coffee before Liebeck's case. And yet it had never changed its practices. It's 700 people that had claimed burns from McDonald's coffee, and they'd never changed the temperature, provided different warnings, or changed the design of their cups. The documentary also examined how news outlets and late night comedians contributed to a distorted public perception, often omitting those key details or portraying Liebeck as greedy rather than an elderly woman with life-altering injuries. And again, it was amazing how these business influences came in, they ran with it, they pushed the narrative. And so the broader themes of the documentary, so looking beyond the McDonald's case, the documentary used it as a springboard to discuss larger systemic issues in the United States legal system, including tort reform and corporate influence. And I've talked a little bit in the past about tort reform, and that's basically where business interests, insurance interests are always pushing on lawmakers to restrict the rights of consumers, of people like you and me, to make claims when we're hurt because of somebody else's wrongdoing. And this film argued that corporations use cases like Liebeck's to push for limits on lawsuits. That involves caps, limits on damages that can get recovered, restrictions on class action lawsuits, things like shortening the time periods that a lawsuit can be brought for an injury claim, just things like that. And those things ultimately reduce consumer protections. The documentary also discussed mandatory arbitration, and I've talked about that in the past as well. And mandatory arbitration is where businesses include arbitration clauses in their contracts, making it harder for individuals to sue companies for legitimate purposes. And as a matter of fact, I did a TikTok video on McDonald's specifically when last year they updated the terms of service for their mobile app. And in there, they put that if you used their mobile app, then you agreed, if you went into their store and got hurt, you didn't even use the mobile app, but you went in there and something happened and they were at fault, you agreed to go to mandatory arbitration. So basically, companies pushing people to arbitration and waiving their right to a jury trial. And the problem with that is corporations essentially own arbitrations. They are the ones that create the system. They get the arbitrators that are favorable to them. And when you agree to go to arbitration, you significantly reduce your rights. So the documentary talks about that as well. It also dealt with other cases of civil justice injustice. The documentary examined additional cases where tort reform negatively impacted individuals seeking justice, framing the issue as a corporate strategy to limit liability rather than an effort to curb frivolous lawsuits. And I've talked in the past, people, matter of fact, I talked in the last episode, people, are fed this idea that, oh, you file a lawsuit, you're going to get paid. So everybody's filing lawsuits. It's just that easy payday. And it's not the truth. And again, my last episode, which we'll put up here in the top of the screen here at the end of the video, I recommend you go watch that. And you can see, again, just 1 year snapshot of juries in the Kansas City area. And you can see that it's not a slam dunk. Less than half of the time last year did a jury find in favor of the person bringing a claim. The evidence has always been that juries are not out of control. And this documentary highlighted that throughout. And that was in 2011, that documentary was released. So this documentary came out and it changed public perception. So we went away from that narrative that led out of Liebeck. And then this documentary came out, and many viewers who had previously mocked or dismissed the lawsuit reconsidered their stance after watching the film, realizing, actually getting the information about the case. And it sparked discussions about the real impact of corporate legal strategies on consumer rights. And let me tell you, if you don't believe there are corporate strategies to limit responsibility and limit consumers' rights, then your head is in the sand, because they're always working to that effect. Corporations, business interest, insurance interest are always working to tamp down the ability of people like you and me to hold them responsible. Now, some legal scholars and activists after this documentary, they used it to advocate against tort reform measures, and specifically that limited individual legal recourse. And while hot coffee didn't completely undo the negative public perception of the lawsuit, it helped shift the conversation and encourage people to dig deeper into the facts before dismissing cases as frivolous. And the documentary remains an important piece in reshaping how we view that McDonald's hot coffee case, and more broadly, the role of litigation in our society in holding corporations accountable. And this is what I always say. People can be against lawsuits. They can have their perceptions, but I will tell you this. If you're the one that gets hurt, that's the quickest way to change your perception, because that's when the rubber hits the road. And that's when people realize, wow, you mean I've gone through all of this? I've had all these medical bills, this lost time from work, all of the, when we say pain and suffering, it's such a broad overview, but you can talk about daily struggles, not being able to do things you once could do, not enjoying life like you once did, requiring future care for the rest of your life. That's when the rubber hits the road. And, this documentary went a long way to help shift that discussion and let people see what truly is involved or is in play here. And, this McDonald's case really highlighted issues of corporate responsibility versus personal accountability. Because again, business interests, insurance interests, they want to say nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions anymore. That's the narrative. This lady spilled coffee all over her, and now she wants to hold McDonald's responsible. But when you broke it down and you went into the history and you found out that McDonald's had 700 prior burns reported to them, well, now it starts to look like, is it all on this lady? Or does McDonald's share in the responsibility? Is it serving its coffee above industry standards? These were the things that came out. And of course, one of the questions that comes from all of this is, did the lawsuit serve justice, or did it set a dangerous precedent? And these are the larger debates, right? But from my perspective, the lawsuit did what it was supposed to do. It compensated this lady. The judge intervened as the law requires and brought things down to where the judge thought it was reasonable. The jury assessed her with some fault, right? It wasn't 100% on McDonald's. They weighed it carefully. They provided fault to her. They provided fault to McDonald's. So when you look at the totality of it, there was nothing about this lawsuit that was frivolous. Nothing. Serious injury. McDonald's knew, and she was tagged with some of the responsibility. There it is. So my closing thoughts on the McDonald's hot coffee case is that, again, it wasn't as frivolous as many believed at all. Again, for all the reasons that I've pointed out. It's a fascinating study. And now we've had so many years to kind of look how this evolved. Again, I personally lived it, was a personal injury lawyer during it, and I've seen it go from the initial reaction all the way through to the change and the discussions that happened in there and the public perceptions and the discussions about corporate responsibility, about media influence, about these underlying interests that are there trying to craft the narrative for their own benefit. And then the public perception of lawsuits and how that is driven by what is out there in the media. So I would encourage you to question anything. And listen, we're in a time now with social media that it is so much easier because we no longer have to rely on just essentially one grouping source of information. With social media, there are so many outlets that are providing so many different opinions, viewpoints, and it's such an easy way now to really try to get to the bottom of a story. And I just encourage listeners, really on whatever it is, not just in the legal world, but whatever you're presented with, do your research, right? Be informed. Don't just go along with whatever the general media narrative is. See what others are saying about it. And so I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember, click on this other video and you can learn more about what juries are actually doing in Kansas City. And as always, I hope you found this episode useful, informational. Leave us a 5-star review. And if we can help you, give us a call. Until next time, stay safe, stay well.